rated T to M. Hey, want to hear a PC Game Pass ad? I'll take your silence as a yes. Want new games on day one like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or Stalker 2? I thought so. How about unlocking all the League of Legends champions when you link your Riot Games account? All for one low monthly price? Well, guess what? We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Stalker 2 available November 20th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. And that's the end of the script.
Hello again. I'm very, very excited about this conversation. So we are joined by former Congressman Jeb Hensarling, who I'd like for him to tell you a little bit about himself. But one thing he is not going to mention, I'm sure, so I will mention it for him. Mr. Hensarling was the very first candidate for Congress that Eric Erickson ever financially supported. That was...
Well, I think he only wanted his money back once or twice. I informed him we had a 60-day refund policy and he was out of luck.
Over his time in Congress, Mr. Hensarling was chairman of the Conservative Republican Study Committee, chairman of the House Republican Conference, chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. And so we're going to talk a little bit about spending fights, tax fights, the direction of the party, and a lot of the fights that are coming up next year, as you probably know, have been had before, and he's been through a number of them. So very much looking forward to getting your thoughts. Let's dive right in, Mr. Hensarling. So we're looking at about $4 trillion worth of debate, if you will, with the expiration of portions of the TCJA, the debt limit fight, the spending caps, and things like that. At a very high level, what are your thoughts on the situation that faces Congress next year as you look back at prior versions of these fights that you were involved in?
Well, first, thanks for the case of PTSD, remembering all these different fights we had that could have turned out a little bit better. Listen, Akash, I try to be an optimist and say these are opportunities. So it is kind of ironic that government spending tends to be permanent and tax relief tends to be temporary. So there are a number of these provisions that are expiring, particularly marginal rates for families. Those are expiring. The increase in the standard deduction, that's expiring. Some of the pass-through provisions, and there's a few provisions impacting business as well. So one way or the other, there's a lot on the line when it comes to economic growth. I got to tell you, the crowning achievement, certainly the crowning economic achievement of the last administration was this bill. Gave a shot of adrenaline into economic growth, improved everybody's lives. So there's a lot on the line in this election. And it's kind of inside baseball. You probably already heard it. But most legislative matters take 60 votes in the Senate. But as a generalization, when it comes to tax policy, 51. That's why this election, at least when it comes to this tax provision, economic growth, the balance sheets of families, is really important. But putting that aside, Akash, we're going to be hitting the national debt ceiling yet again. We're going to have another funding bill yet again. So there are going to be some challenges, but a lot of opportunities.
Absolutely. So how do you think about the debt limit? I think we hear some crazy ideas as far as how conservatives should fight on it or let it expire. I mean, there's also some pretty terrible consequences if we actually don't address that. But of course, the spending is out of control. So in the past, how have conservatives tried to leverage that? And what do you recommend they should be thinking about as that fight comes up in 2025?
Well, I do have a few thoughts, but my colleagues didn't listen closely to me when I was in Congress. I don't know if they're going to listen to me now. But number one, people need to know we've had a debt ceiling law on the books since 1913. There have been well over 100 different votes on the debt ceiling, and not one of them have ever led to default on sovereign debt. So the number one pushback you hear, oh my God, we're going to default on our debt, world markets are going to crater. Listen, I don't take it lightly. Every single day I was in Congress, somebody said, oh my God, we have a crisis. Well, I would say defaulting on your debt is a crisis. I would say also ignoring your debt is a crisis. Something else you need to know going into this debate. What passes for fiscal responsibility in the federal city, almost every single time it's been attached to a debt ceiling bill. I mean, that's what happens when you hit the roadblock. You're supposed to do something about it. So whether it be the old pay-go provisions, spending caps, you can go back to the 80s, the Graham-Rudman sequester, none of that would have happened except for a debt ceiling vote. But you always have forces, the Democrats, the press, Wall Street, everybody is going to be talking about economic Armageddon. And so if my former colleagues were to take my advice, and I advised them about this at the time, you gotta take off the table the number one impediment to leveraging the debt ceiling to reduce the debt. That is, take default of sovereign debt off the table and say, we're not going to use interest on the national debt in calculating it. And so you remove the largest impediment, all of a sudden you have leverage. And I can tell you, when we're in divided government, for all intents and purposes, there are only two votes that count. The periodic vote to increase the debt ceiling and the annual appropriation bill or bills. Outside of that, you're not terribly relevant. I can tell you what, Joe Biden did not need the help of a Republican Congress to do what he did. He was doing it through executive order in the administrative state. And so, you know, I'd love to have spending caps and pay-go, and I could bore people with all the various different budget process reforms. They're important. But you take default of sovereign debt off the table, you have leverage to make real change.
Absolutely. Now, that's a great segue to this second piece of the 2025 fiscal cliff is spending caps, government appropriations. Now, you've been a part of several different versions of trying to do something about this. Simpson Bowles, the super committee, folks will remember the grand bargain during the Obama years, all of it. We seem to so often be in these fights, and you've got a small wing of the conservative wing of the party that says, hey, let's have a government shutdown and fight over whatever the case may be. But ultimately, what ends up happening is the government shuts down. We don't ever end up getting the policy wins that we fight for. We never end up cutting spending, and then Republicans take all the political blame for the shutdown too. And so that never really seems to work. What should the approach be? Talk about some experiences you've had on government funding fights, and then same kind of things. What are lessons you've learned about what works and doesn't work, and what conservatives should actually be fighting for when it comes to spending next year?
Well, I would have several observations having lived through this before. One, united we stand, divided we fall. And too often, Republicans have not coalesced around one plan. Here's what we agree we'll do. Here is the price that we're going to set to vote on these appropriations bills. And so you may start off with so many different plans that there isn't an opportunity to unify around one. So that would be point number one. If you can't unify around a plan, I can assure you the Democrats are going to unify in opposition. Point number one. Point number two is this is the real world. Whatever you come up with is going to have to be defensible in the court of public opinion. Mark Twain once wrote, in America, public opinion is everything. Some believe it to be the voice of God. So it's not the voice of God, but I can tell you it's very important in political battles because once again, you're going to be aligned against the same forces of the Democrats and the national press and so much of Wall Street and social media. So you got to be able, whatever you do, to be defensible in the court of public opinion. And I got to tell you, the last, I guess this is actually the debt ceiling bill, relative to history, was a pretty good bill. But when it comes to shutdown, again, you're not on the political high ground to do that. There's a number of process reforms that could slightly bend the cost curve, but not unlike taking default of sovereign debt off the table. I would take shutdown off the table. When I was in Congress, myself and a number of other conservatives sponsored legislation, take it off the table and then just flatline it. Flatline it. I assure you that the Democrats cannot take a government that's not growing, and they will come, and then you have leverage to negotiate. But let me tell you, practically, having lived through these battles, what happens? Okay, you agree you're going to hold the line on spending. I've served in Republican majorities. I've never served in a conservative majority in the House of Representatives. So number one, you have moderates, good people. Some of my best friends are moderates. But let me tell you, when the going gets tough, they head to the exit, number one. Number two, appropriators. There's an old joke on Capitol Hill. There's Republicans, there's Democrats, and then there are appropriators. And that's what they do. They want to be able to spend money. And so if you flatline it, or you just do what is known as this continuing resolution, they don't get to do what they want to do. And they are a very tight-knit bunch. Last but not least, I've never seen a battle between what we call defense hawks and fiscal hawks that the defense hawks didn't win. So number one, nothing more important than our government can do than to protect us from all enemies, foreign and domestic, to protect our freedoms, our liberty, our families. But let me tell you, Republicans are terrible poker players. Terrible poker players. So you may know there's a dozen different appropriations bills, one being for national defense. So if you were to come to one of these shutdown situations, I would pass the national defense bill and I would send it over to say if it was a Democrat Senate or what. And if they didn't vote it, or they voted it down, I'd send it over again, I'd send it over a third time. At some point, they're gonna have to vote for a national defense bill. And so if we would be good poker players and stiffen our backbone, eventually the Democrats would have to vote for it. And then once we fund national defense, how much more do we care about than what the federal government is doing? I mean, I exaggerate slightly to make the point. But then you have true leverage. But I've been through this battle many, many times, and so you may read about it, in theory, but I'm telling you what happens in actual practice is why so little has been done. The last thing I'd say about that, Akash, is, listen, some good work has been done occasionally on what we've managed to attach on kind of these shutdown efforts. But you got to know that when it comes to the debt ceiling, when it comes to these annual appropriations bills, as we're standing in the face of the single largest debt in America's history, these don't even amount to rounding errors. So don't let any member of Congress come up and tell you, look at the great job I did. I managed to carve 2% off this appropriation bill. With all due respect, they ain't done nothing when it comes to the national debt.
So really quickly, folks might have remembered in the past year or so, when Mike Johnson became Speaker, one of the ideas he put forward was a debt commission, a fiscal commission. There have been different versions of these commissions. What are your thoughts on that idea and how something like that can actually be fruitful and successful?
Well, I serve, again, on two of them, both of which I'd have to put down as failures. I never worked so hard to achieve so little in my life as being a part of those two ventures. A couple of observations. Number one, if you're going to actually deal with the debt, and you've heard it here at the gathering already, I don't want to throw a whole lot of numbers at you. So if you got the bar chart, 100% of federal spending, 70%. 70% of that is what we call either entitlement spending, mandatory spending. I think my preferred term is automatic pilot spending. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the national debt, okay? So that's 70%. Okay, what's the other 30% of government? Half of that is national defense. So by and large, and listen, there can be savings in the Pentagon, I assure you. You know, Eisenhower, when he talked about the military-industrial complex, he knew what he was talking about. So quite literally, there's more bang to get for the buck, but you can't do major surgery. And Republicans, by and large, and conservatives, by and large, don't want to do major surgery on the defense budget. That leaves 15% of the rest of government. And so my point is, unless you have a commission that's actually willing to deal with entitlements, and that doesn't mean cut. You don't have to cut a penny out of Social Security. You don't have to cut a penny out of Medicare, but you have to bend the growth curve. And listen, if you let me be king for a day, I can get you better Social Security at a cheaper price. Medicare is a little bit more difficult. So I remember when I was co-chairman of the less than super committee, and I walked in day one, and John Kerry, bless his heart, he's one pompous guy, but anyway. So he comes up to me and says, well, I don't think I know you. I said, well, Senator, the truth is I don't know you. So we got that out of the way. And I said to him, and listen, this is just political reality. I said to him, and I said to Senator Patty Murray, who was the Democratic co-chairman, I said, I want Paul Ryan's Medicare premium support reform. You tell me what size tax increase I need to agree to for you to give it to me. And the answer was, well, we're not going to give you that, but before this is over, we'll put some significant entitlement reform on the table. Never happened. Never happened. So part of my point is that you can't deal with the national debt, and I pray you take this seriously, because it is a deadly serious matter. Now, nobody in this room is probably going to be impacted. I can tell you I'm personally not going to be impacted. The last two income streams that will ever cease in America are Social Security payments and congressional pensions, okay? I'm getting the congressional pension now, and pretty soon I'm going to be getting that Social Security payment, and they're both indexed for inflation. So this isn't something I'm going to suffer from, but my children will, your children will, your grandchildren will. So we got to take it seriously as a nation, and we're not. And I can tell you there's no solution that isn't going to combine entitlement reforms, paying the price with some type of tax increase. I'm just telling you, that's what it is. Good policy is going to cost you bad policy. I don't know about you, nothing good in my life came free. I spent thousands of dollars on an engagement ring for my wife. She was worth every penny of it. But my point is, if we're going to save America from bankruptcy, and if we're going to figure out a way to get better retirement security at a cheaper price, better health care at a cheaper price, Democrats, and I don't know why God made so many of them, but he did. They're going to demand a tax increase. I want a tax increase. It's going to harm families. It's going to harm the economy. But you're going to have to deal with the reality. We're going to have to deal with the reality of society, that's what is still known as the grand bargain that continues to elude us today.
Yep. So these are some important guiding principles on the spending side. And then there is, of course, the tax debate facing Congress next year. Now, we might be in a scenario of a Republican trifecta, and even then, there is far from universal agreement on how to handle the next tax reform conversation. But we do, of course, want to build on the 2017 tax bill. Sort of what did it take to get to what the TCJA ended up being? What was that conversation in those debates like, even within the Republican Party? And based on that, given where we are today fiscally and politically, what should the guiding principles be for tax reform looking ahead?
Well, fortunately, again, tax relief as a general principle is something that can be done with 51 votes in the Senate. And once we got past kind of the more esoteric discussion, I mean, listen, I would love just to repeal the 16th Amendment and substitute it with a national sales tax. If I remember, that idea came out of Georgia in the first place. So now that I got my pipe dream out of the way, it was a priority of President Trump. It was a priority of Speaker Ryan. So number one, you had the top brass pushing for this and pushing hard. And it's also something that Republicans had been working on for quite some time. And so public policy, you gotta be ready for the moment, but it takes a while to normalize the idea, beta test the idea, and really get the politics right. I think in terms of everything rests on principle. Once you get the principle right, then you worry about the policy. And you gotta normalize that policy, test the policy, because in public policy, the details really matter. Only then, when you get the principle right, the policy right, then you worry about the politics. And you do have to worry about the politics, but Akash, all that came together. And again, it was the signature achievement of the Trump-Pence administration. I got to tell you, if you look at the numbers, nothing gave a jolt to economic growth and personal family opportunity quite like that. So what I would be looking at is, what could we do to, again, make more of these provisions permanent? I mean, the principles in the tax code are, what is it we can do to get a more, permanent, particularly when it comes to economic growth. You know, I know we got a lot of business people out here. You got to have some degree of certainty before you plop down large amounts of capital that you're not going to get a return on for many, many years. So I would go back and work on the permanence aspect. And for all the great things that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act achieved, simplicity was not one of them, okay? I would go, because I don't quite remember the numbers, but it's something like our tax code is like, 500 times longer than the Declaration of the Constitution, and no, maybe it's 500 times longer than the Bible, and I don't know. I'll make it up, a gazillion pages longer than the Constitution. You get the idea as an order of magnitude. So the complexity of the tax code needs to be taken care of as well. Otherwise, what can we do to make it flatter, broaden the base? I mean, some Republicans want to take people off the tax rolls. Frankly, I think the opposite. I think everybody needs to be, I don't care if you're paying $1.57 to the tax code. Everybody's got to have some skin in the game. So what can we do to make it broader, more simple, permanent? Those are some of the aspects I would work on. Specifically pro-growth, we didn't really touch cap gains. I would work on the capital gains tax. It was brought up before that immediate expensing is a very important pro-growth item as well.
Yeah. That's great. One of the things, unfortunately, it's being batted around as a pay for, and just given kind of where we are in the world, are trade tariffs. You've written a lot about this in the Wall Street Journal. This is an idea that I think comes from a reasonable concern, which is our competition with China and kind of how we fit into a global system that's not always fair to us, but they are ultimately harmful to the American people. I mean, talk a little bit about how we should think about trade and tariffs, and particularly as it pertains to our competition with China.
Well, one, when I was in Congress, I probably agreed with 90% of what the Trump-Pence administration did. I publicly disagreed with President Trump on trade. Now, I braced for impact when I did, but I think he got that wrong. And so let's talk about China. China's unique. Listen, national defense trumps other issues, so I get it. But trade promotes economic growth. Before the president came in, number one, the US and I think Germany and China had some of the lowest tariffs. The highest tariffs nations in the world, Botswana, Niger. Now, tell me who has greatest economic growth, okay? Number one, trade promotes economic growth. When President Trump instituted his tariffs on steel and aluminum and his tariffs on China, number one, almost overnight, the price of a washer went up $100. Okay, I think it was $86 to be exact. And by a lot of the economic studies I looked at, and I spent years and years looking at economic studies. I'm an economic nerd. Just ask my wife. His tariffs probably cut off 2.2 to 0.3% of GDP. And so he gave us so much tax relief, and then he started taking a little bit of it away. And by the way, you don't do tariffs in a vacuum. Then all of a sudden you get retaliation, and we're having to write a $12 billion check to bail out farmers because of retaliation. To me, trade can be a national defense tool. We ought to not just be onshoring, but we need to be friend-shoring. We need to help strengthen the economies of Japan. We need to help strengthen the economies of Korea. We need to help strengthen the economies of Poland. So this 10% tariff across the board, again, China's a different case. China is a very different case. But if there is ever a watchword or phrase, free trade with free countries. And I would finally say this, that free trade is not a foreign policy. It's not just a domestic economic policy. It's a matter of freedom, personal freedom. Who is the government to tell me that if I want to buy a sweater in Poland instead of Peoria? I'm a free American, okay? People came to these shores for freedom of religion, for freedom from political tyranny, but they came here for economic freedom as well. You remember why they threw the tea in the harbor? There was a tariff on it, okay? Take a look at our nation's history.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important point, which is that trade itself can be a weapon against China, right? The countries that surround China, that are friendly to us, adversarial to China, trade deals with those countries are not just good economically, they also isolate China and kind of take China off the world stage a little bit. And so there are other options beyond just, if people want to build things in America, that's fantastic, obviously. But these trade deals with other countries can also help do so while, of course, benefiting us, because trade is, of course, valuable to domestic manufacturers. Talk a little bit briefly, just quickly, about
60%, I believe the last time I looked at the numbers, 60% of our imports are actually intermediate goods to help produce something else in America. It's not just consumer items. So a lot of those businesses would be harmed. And by the way, when the president, our previous president, imposed these tariffs, all of a sudden there were real-world economic consequences, and he had to set up a whole labyrinth of government bureaucrats to start issuing waivers to his tariffs. And so you had a line wrapped around the Commerce Department 5 times over, full of lawyers and lobbyists having to go and get their particular carve-outs. And I got to tell you, I mean, that's draining the swamp? No, that's putting more alligators in the swamp. It's choosing winners and losers. We don't want that. And so listen, I don't know. Maybe the president is just doing what he often does, and that is be unpredictable, try to set up a good negotiating stance. If he is, God bless him, bless his heart. But if he really means it, he's going to give us so much with tax relief, and he's going to take so much of it away, and take it away in our jobs, in our own domestic American industry, if he follows through on that plan.
Last thought, you won a red district in Texas many times. You're no slouch on social conservatism or cultural conservatism, and yet you fought on those issues without giving up ground on limited government conservatism. Talk about how to do both of those things, how we can fight on social and cultural issues without giving up our limited government principles.
In the 12 seconds we have left,
go for it.
Listen, the cultural wars are very important. DEI, ESG are pernicious. The cultural war isn't just about us eating barbecue, them eating tofu, us driving pickups, them driving Prius. But ultimately, this is not about us and them. This is about a creator who endowed us with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we can't have liberty unless others have liberty. The liberty to disagree with what we believe and what we do. And ultimately, you must limit the size, scope, power, and expense of the federal government. We can't have free speech if they don't have free speech. Too often, I see we're already over time. This big government conservatism, it's almost like people say, I want to drain the swamp. No, what they're trying to do is retrain the alligators to bite the other person, okay? You can't retrain the alligators. They cannot be retrained. So ultimately, crimp the fuel lines of big government, and we will secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hensarling.